So Malcolm, thank you so much for joining me today. Can I ask first of all, what is your reaction to the explosion at the hospital in Gaza last night, and what will the implications be for the talks going on now with President Biden arriving in the region?
Well, it's the explosion at the hospital is, of course, a very dreadful event, particularly, obviously, for those in the hospital. That is something which is quite ghastly to contemplate. The issue, the political issue, of course, is the responsibility for that. That is not yet clear. The Israelis have been doing many airstrikes on Gaza. It cannot be excluded that I don't think deliberately. I don't think it's remotely possible the Israelis would have deliberately intended to hit the hospital, but it might have happened by accident. But that's not their position. Their position is that it was Islamic Jihad. Well, I think if they want to carry credibility on that claim, my advice to them would be not only to produce the evidence, and they seem to have some evidence pointing in that direction, but to submit it to a completely independent group of people whom they can trust and the rest of the world can trust to come to an honest judgment as to whether the responsibility was indeed that of Islamic Jihad.
And of course, with President Biden being in the region, he's meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu, but his meetings have been cancelled with King Abdullah of Jordan, with President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi of Egypt, and the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. Is that seen as a huge setback?
I think it can only be considered a serious setback. I think the decision to cancel was both the president's and the Arab countries concerned. I think it was a joint decision. But the original reason, as I understand it, for the president traveling to Israel was to discuss with the Israelis what they are proposing to do, to discuss various issues, particularly humanitarian support in Gaza during any forthcoming conflict. So the primary purpose of his visit continues to be justified. It is very unfortunate that the opportunity to also discuss with other Arab leaders what might be done has been lost because of the terrible events at the hospital yesterday.
Well, reportedly, he will be speaking to them on the phone on his return to Washington. What can he hope to achieve by his visiting the region?
Well, I don't think by himself, and I pay all credit to President Biden for the initiative he's taking. I think it is very, very important in terms of the president choosing to travel to Israel at this moment in time. But of course, the main events that will determine the future of Gaza and of Israel will be determined by the Israeli decision to enter Gaza, as is now extremely likely.
How shocked have you been by the escalation of the violence and the conflict since the original Hamas attack on October 7th?
Well, you say since the attack, but of course one really has to begin with the attack, because this was not just another attack on Israel by its Palestinian opponents. What Hamas quite consciously chose to do was to turn themselves from being already a very militant, and some would say terrorist organization, into something much closer to ISIS. Deliberately using unrestricted brutality on women, children, people with no political connection with the dispute, but killing and murdering and maiming for its own sake. Now, that has actually had very serious consequences, because it makes Hamas an organization, rather like ISIS was. The rest of the world will be unable to treat as a normal political organization, whatever the immediate future might hold. That's the first point I would make.
What do you think is going on in terms of the negotiations to release the hostages? And of course, Qatar is getting involved because they have direct route to Hamas.
Qatar has a lot of experience in mediation, not just in the Middle East, but in other parts of the world. They've just been responsible very successfully in persuading the Russians to release 4 children who were kidnapped from Ukraine and allow them to return to Ukraine. That was in itself quite an achievement, given that the Russian-Ukrainian war is continuing as we speak. So I wouldn't underestimate Qatar's relevance to this matter. They do have knowledge of some of the Hamas people. They are able to speak to them directly. And therefore, we must hope that will help make progress. But of course, we have to not be naive about this. The Israelis who were taken hostage for a reason. They wanted to be, the Hamas wanted to use them as a negotiating tool. I suspect their original intention was to ensure that they could be released in exchange for large numbers of Hamas prisoners who were convicted in Israel of terrorism and are currently in Israeli jails. I presume that was the initial reason. But now that there is a major war likely to be happening over the next few weeks, then the position of the hostages is even more vulnerable as a consequence of that.
Well, how do you think Prime Minister Netanyahu has handled the crisis so far? There was a recent poll in an Israeli newspaper saying that over 66% of the people there want him out after the war.
Yeah, I think Netanyahu must realize that his days as prime minister are numbered. And it's not just what happens over the next few weeks. However successful the Israeli Defense Force might be in rooting out Hamas's military potential in Gaza, once the immediate conflict is over, the new coalition will not continue. It's only there to cover the actual military side of this issue. And then overwhelmingly, and rightly, Netanyahu will be held to have a high degree of responsibility, not only because he is ultimately the security minister. If the intelligence agencies, if the army, the armed forces failed, then that's the government's responsibility, and he is the prime minister. But it's not just that, because for the last 6 to 9 months, he was responsible as prime minister for the most divisive internal domestic political initiatives that totally divided Israel. We all remember the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Israelis protesting and demonstrating. That went on month after month. And he was warned that by people in the military and in the intelligence agencies, you are distracting Israel's attention from its external security on this divisive domestic issue. There could be a price to pay. And that is now exactly what has happened. So I think that the polls that you have mentioned are not just an immediate reaction. My judgment, for what it's worth, is that there will be a settled view in Israel that the current Israeli government must go. And I hope also that a second thing, if I may, what is necessary is for not just the Israeli Netanyahu people, but the whole spectrum of Israeli political opinion, perhaps to reconsider their approach to the Palestinians over the last few years, because there has been almost a consensus amongst all the Israeli major political parties that the Palestinians can be ignored. They're stuck in the West Bank, they're stuck in Gaza. Let's leave them there and forget about them and concentrate on our relations with the UAE, with Saudi Arabia, with the other countries of the region. That was never feasible. That's never possible. You cannot simply ignore the people who for 60, 70 years, rightly or wrongly, have this fundamental grievance that their land has been taken from them. So I hope that this ghastly conflict we're in at the moment will lead to a political initiative once the fighting is finished by the Israelis across the political spectrum to say we now have to look again at our whole relationship with the Palestinians and what that might lead to.
What about the threat from Iran? How far-reaching are the ramifications, do you think, of this conflict?
It is a serious threat. This is not just Israeli propaganda. I mean, for example, we know that immediately after the Hamas carried out their ghastly terrorist attacks, they actually put out a statement, a public statement, thanking Iran for their help to Hamas. Now, we don't know for certain exactly what that help was, but almost certainly we do know that Hamas have been supplied with arms smuggled into Gaza over the years, some of which will have been used in the Hamas attacks. But in addition to that, Iran makes no secret in their public statements that through their very close links with Hezbollah on Israel's northern border, with the lesser but still very substantial links they've had with Hamas, and with their general desire to destabilize anything that might be relevant to their fundamental hostility to Israel, they are an evil force in this particular matter. So these are not just Israeli allegations. There's no serious doubt. Even the Iranians do not challenge that they are doing all within their power to damage Israel. And that is something which, incidentally, has another consequence, because their other enemy in the region is Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia and Israel both have a common concern about Iran. And, you know, in politics as well as elsewhere, sometimes my enemy's enemy is my friend. And that is why the Saudis and Israelis until very recently, were struggling to see if they could improve their relationship. That will come back. There is a fundamental strategic reason why Israel and Saudi Arabia will come to the view that they have more in common than that which unfortunately still divides them.
What about the worsening humanitarian crisis within Gaza? The lack of aid, water, fuel and food getting through. What should happen now?
Well, I think the answer is not that difficult to identify, because most of the people who live in Gaza City took the advice. It wasn't an order. The Israelis couldn't give an order, but they took the advice of the Israelis to move out of Gaza City and move to the south. So although there are still obviously people in Gaza City, most of the population are now in the south of Gaza, and that happens to share a common border with Egypt. It's only 6 miles wide, but that is easily enough. Now, the Egyptians have been extremely nervous that if they simply open their border, they'll have huge numbers of Palestinian refugees coming into Egypt. And one can understand why the Egyptians are not prepared to agree to that. But there's no reason why that should stop them doing the opposite, opening their border for all the humanitarian aid. A lot of it is already on the border, allowing it to cross that border into southern Gaza. That is food, that is medical supplies, that is many other things that are desperately needed. And there's no shortage of aid being available. At the moment, it's on the wrong side of the Egyptian border. And there's no reason that I can see why, without any threat to Egypt's interests, they could not open that border and allow that aid to come in as we speak, almost certainly in the next couple of days.
It's been reported that Prime Minister Rishi Sunak will travel to Israel. What do you advise him to do?
Well, I think it's all part of a broader belief that it is right for the international community to demonstrate that on this issue, not on every single issue that affects the Israeli-Palestinian matter, many people have disagreed with the Israeli government on the way it's handled the Palestinian issue. But that aside, nothing that might divide Israelis and Palestinians justifies the mindless cruelty and barbarity of what Hamas did. And that given that they did that, they have transformed themselves into an organization like ISIS. Therefore, they have to be treated in the same way. And not just ISIS. If you think of, for example, the Twin Tower attacks in New York, 9/11, when Al-Qaeda were responsible. So when an organization chooses to act with mindless savagery and brutality, then the international community should do all within their power to support the victim. And that, I think, is largely behind what the Prime Minister is proposing to do.
When you were Foreign Secretary, for the first time the British government committed to a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. Is there any hope of that happening in our lifetime?
Well, it depends how long you're proposing to be around. I don't want to be naive or simplistic. It's become much more difficult for all the reasons that we're familiar with, not least the increased number of Israeli settlements on the West Bank. But, you know, if people say they're against a two-state solution, we're entitled to say to them, well, what is your alternative? You can't just leave the status quo to go on for another 50 years, another 100 years, because as we've seen, Palestinians will not live with that. Why should they live with that? They are not the states, or the citizens of any state, but the only part of the world that doesn't have a state of its own. So something needs to be done, and it's not a two-state solution. Is it seriously being considered that you could have a one-state solution? Because if you combine Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza into one state, first of all, Israel ceases to be a Jewish state. It becomes inevitably a country with a majority, but also a very large minority of Arab and Palestinian and Muslim people. If, on the other hand, you say, well, that's okay, but we won't give the Palestinians on the West Bank full political rights in a one-state Israel, then you really are creating an apartheid state. That's exactly what the South Africans tried to do with apartheid. So I don't think that'll be acceptable either within Israel or to the wider international community. So, you know, when you rule out everything else, whatever's left, however difficult, becomes the course of action you should take. And I believe as strongly now as I did when I made the statement you mentioned way back in 1996, 97, that a two-state solution, and Israel and Palestinians got very close to agreeing on one when Ehud Barak was negotiating with Arafat. Sadly, Arafat withdrew at the last moment before a deal could be done. So one day that we'll get back to that.
How concerned are you about the rise of anti-Semitism around the world and also the terror attacks we've seen recently in northern France and in Belgium?
Well, of course, I'm very concerned. I am Jewish myself, so it's not surprising. I have a particular empathy with those who are worried about these matters. But let me just make one point, if I may. And there is a question to be asked, because this is not the kind of anti-Semitism that we've seen in Europe over hundreds of years. This anti-Semitism overwhelmingly is to deal with the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And the people, not every single one of them, but most of the vast majority of people who have been seen to be carrying out anti-Semitic attacks on Jewish people in Europe or America or wherever it might be, not all of them, but the vast majority of them are either Palestinians themselves or people who have for a long time strongly identified with the Palestinian point of view. They can't get close to Israelis in Europe or in America, and they assume, not incorrectly, that most Jewish people are pro-Israeli. So they become the target of their anger, their frustration, their hostility, their hatred. So yes, there has been a big increase of anti-Semitism. Yes, it is deeply disturbing, but we should realize that this is not the sort of anti-Semitism that Europe and the world faced in the 1930s or in previous generations.
Just finally, Sir Malcolm, with the escalation of the violence in the region right now and the suffering on both sides, what do you think will happen next? The world is holding its breath.
Yes, I think it's pretty unavoidable that the immediate future is going to be the Israeli army moving into Gaza. And what they're seeking to do, so far as I can follow, is not so much destroy Gaza, not destroy the infrastructure of Gaza. What they're aiming for is Hamas's military capability. Whether they will be able to destroy that capability is itself a very controversial matter. They could certainly do a huge amount of damage to it, and that's what I think they will be seeking to do, to degrade Hamas's capability of launching the sort of attack we saw a week or so ago ever again. And if they achieve that, they have no intention of staying in Gaza. What they will then do is withdraw to Israel, and then we'll be into a political process rather than a military one. But that could be a few weeks, perhaps even a couple of months ahead before that actually happens.
Sir Malcolm Rifkind, thank you very much for joining me today.
Hi, I'm Joanna Bersecci, and thank you for watching. You can check out more of our videos by clicking on the boxes on the screen. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more from CNBC International. Thank you for watching.